At 42, Alexander Sterling stood atop the pinnacle of financial success. He was the embodiment of ambition, a self-made billionaire whose name resonated throughout New York's elite circles. Yet, for all his material wealth, Alexander was a man shrouded in solitude. His towering penthouse on Manhattan's Upper East Side, filled with exquisite art and priceless antiques, reflected not only his impeccable taste but also the cold, calculated life he had meticulously built. Alexander's daily routine was as predictable as it was isolating. He began his mornings with a black coffee on the penthouse balcony, overlooking the sprawling skyline of the city that never slept. It was a view most could only dream of. But to Alexander, it felt hollow. The bustling streets below, filled with the cacophony of lives intersecting, served as a stark reminder of what he lacked, a connection to something greater than himself. Twice married and twice divorced, Alexander had long abandoned the notion of love. His ex-wives, drawn more to his wealth than to the man himself, had left him disillusioned. To him, love was a flawed concept, riddled with risks and instability. He had traded emotional vulnerability for professional dominance, building an empire that could withstand anything, except, perhaps, the aching loneliness that gnawed at his core. Beneath his steely exterior lay a man burdened by the weight of his own choices. He yearned for an heir, a child to carry on his name and legacy. This desire was not born of sentimentality but of practicality, a calculated solution to his existential emptiness. Yet, Alexander's approach to life left no room for the unpredictable chaos of romance or family. Love, he often mused to himself, is a risk I cannot afford. Sophia Leclerc's life couldn't have been more different from Alexander's. At 29, she wandered the streets of New York, her once bright future reduced to a daily struggle for survival. Born and raised in the picturesque town of Annecy, France, Sophia had been a gifted artist with a promising career ahead of her. Her sketches captured the beauty and complexity of the human spirit, and her professors had hailed her as a rising star in the art world. But 5 years ago, Sophia had traded the charm of the French Alps for the boundless opportunities of New York City. She arrived with nothing but a suitcase and a portfolio full of dreams, convinced that the city's art scene would embrace her talent. However, the reality was far harsher than she had anticipated. Sophia's early days in New York were filled with hope and determination. She worked tirelessly, submitting her work to galleries and building connections. But as rejections piled up and her savings dwindled, the city's relentless pace began to wear her down. A series of misfortunes, a failed partnership, an unexpected illness, and the skyrocketing cost of living left her with no choice but to abandon her studio and, eventually, her apartment. Now, Sophia was a shadow of her former self, reduced to seeking shelter in crowded subway stations and relying on the kindness of strangers for her next meal. Yet, despite her circumstances, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that set her apart. Her striking blue eyes, though weary, still held a spark of resilience. Her hands, once used to create beauty, were now calloused from the harshness of the streets. Sophia's artistic spirit refused to be extinguished. In moments of quiet, she would pull out a worn sketchbook, one of the few possessions she had managed to keep, and capture the world around her. Her drawings told stories of struggle and hope, of the lives that intersected in the city's crowded corners. Though her circumstances were dire, her art remained a testament to her unyielding spirit. It was fate, or perhaps sheer coincidence, that brought Alexander and Sophia together. On a chilly autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Alexander found himself stopped at a red light near Central Park. In his sleek black car, he was insulated from the world outside. His thoughts consumed by the ever-present void in his life. Sophia, meanwhile, stood at the intersection. Her thin jacket barely enough to ward off the biting wind. She approached the row of cars with hesitant steps, her hand outstretched. When she reached Alexander's window, their eyes met for the first time. Alexander's initial reaction was one of irritation. He rolled down the window just enough to issue a curt dismissal. But as he prepared to drive away, something stopped him. There was a depth in Sophia's gaze, a mixture of resignation and unspoken hope, that stirred something within him. For Sophia, the encounter was yet another reminder of her invisibility in a city that rarely paused for anyone. But as Alexander's car sped away, she couldn't shake the feeling that their brief exchange had left an imprint on her, however fleeting. Later that night, as Alexander sat alone in his expansive living room, the memory of Sophia lingered in his mind. Her eyes, haunted yet defiant, unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. For the first time in years, he felt a pull toward something, or someone, beyond his carefully controlled existence. Sophia, on the other hand, returned to her makeshift shelter with a renewed sense of determination. Though the man in the car had dismissed her, there was something about his gaze that hinted at a crack in his stoic facade. She couldn't know it yet. But their worlds, so vastly different yet similarly hollow, were about to collide in ways that would change both their lives forever. Alexander Sterling sat alone in his luxurious penthouse on Manhattan's Upper East Side. A glass of whiskey resting untouched on the side table beside him. The city lights glittered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting shimmering reflections across the sleek, modern furnishings of his meticulously designed home. The penthouse, with its minimalist elegance and breathtaking views, was the epitome of success, a space that symbolized everything Alexander had worked tirelessly to achieve. Yet, to him, it felt as empty as the glass in his hand. At 42, Alexander was a man who had seemingly mastered life. His name was synonymous with power and wealth. His business empire spanning industries and continents. Yet, for all his success, his personal life was a wasteland, barren of the connections that could give meaning to his achievements. Twice married and twice divorced, Alexander had long since resigned himself to the belief that love was a failed experiment. His first marriage, to a college sweetheart, had ended in mutual disappointment. What began as a partnership filled with shared dreams slowly unraveled under the strain of his relentless ambition and her growing resentment of the life his career demanded. His second marriage was a stark contrast, a whirlwind romance with a younger woman who had captivated him with her charm and spontaneity. For a time, it seemed as though he had found the antidote to his loneliness. But the cracks soon began to show. She loved the lifestyle his wealth afforded, but not the man himself. When the relationship ended, it left Alexander not just heartbroken but bitterly disillusioned. "I'm done with love," he had declared to himself after the second divorce. "It's nothing more than a transaction dressed up in sentiment." From that point on, he devoted himself entirely to his work, pouring all his energy into building an empire that would outlast him. Yet, even as his wealth grew, so did the gnawing sense of emptiness that haunted him in the quiet moments of his day. Despite his disdain for love and relationships, Alexander couldn't ignore the one thing his success had failed to provide: an heir. The thought began to consume him during his late-night reflections. As he considered his legacy and the question of who would carry on the Sterling name. For Alexander, having a child was not about love or family in the traditional sense, it was about continuity. A way to ensure that the empire he had built would endure. But the idea of pursuing another romantic relationship to achieve this goal was unthinkable. He had no desire to subject himself to the emotional turbulence of love or the risk of another failed marriage. I need a successor. Not a partner, he told himself one evening, pacing the length of his penthouse. His thoughts circled relentlessly around the same dilemma. There has to be another way. Alexander's mind worked like a machine, always seeking the most efficient solution to any problem. It wasn't long before he devised a plan that seemed to align perfectly with his values, or lack thereof. If he couldn't find a wife to bear his child without the complications of love, why not bypass the need for love altogether? The answer was clear: surrogacy. But not just any surrogacy. Alexander wanted more control over the process. He didn't want to go through an anonymous agency or deal with the layers of bureaucracy that came with it. He wanted to personally select someone who would agree to his terms. No questions asked. 4 weeks. Alexander researched his options. He consulted lawyers, doctors, and fertility specialists, ensuring that every aspect of his plan was legally and medically sound. The arrangement, he decided, would be strictly professional. The surrogate would receive a generous financial compensation and complete support throughout the pregnancy. But there would be no personal connection. No emotional entanglements. To Alexander, this plan was flawless. It eliminated the unpredictability of relationships and reduced the act of bringing a child into the world to a manageable contractual agreement. It was, in his mind, the perfect solution. Yet, even as Alexander finalized the details of his plan, a shadow of doubt lingered. Though he would never admit it. His desire for an heir wasn't solely rooted in practicality. Beneath his cold, logical exterior was a man who longed for connection, a longing he had buried so deeply that even he struggled to recognize it. He often found himself thinking about his father. A man who had raised him with both discipline and affection. His father's presence had been a guiding force in his life. A source of strength and stability. Now, as he sat alone in his penthouse, Alexander realized that what he truly craved wasn't just a successor to his empire but a chance to experience that bond from the other side. The thought terrified him. Alexander had built his life on control. On the belief that emotions were a weakness. To open himself up to the vulnerability of parenthood felt like a risk he wasn't sure he could take. But the alternative, continuing to live in solitude, with no one to share his legacy, was equally unthinkable. One evening, as Alexander drove home from his office, his thoughts heavy with the weight of his plan, he found himself stopped at a red light near Central Park. The streets were bustling with life. A stark contrast to the sterile silence of his penthouse. As he waited for the light to change, a figure caught his eye, a young woman standing on the corner. Her hand outstretched as she approached the row of cars. She was dressed in a thin, tattered coat. Her disheveled hair framing a face that, despite its weariness, held a quiet dignity. When she reached Alexander's car, he rolled down the window just enough to hear her soft voice. "Do you have anything to spare?" she asked. Her tone a mixture of resignation and hope. Alexander's first instinct was to dismiss her, as he had done countless times before with others in her position. But as he prepared to roll up the window, something in her gaze stopped him. Her piercing blue eyes, filled with a depth of emotion he couldn't quite place, stirred something within him, a flicker of empathy he hadn't felt in years. For a moment, the two of them simply stared at each other. The noise of the city fading into the background. Then, almost impulsively, Alexander reached into his wallet and handed her a crisp bill. As she murmured a quiet thank you and turned away, he found himself lingering at the intersection, watching her disappear into the crowd. Though he didn't realize it at the time, that brief encounter would set into motion a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. In the days that followed, Alexander couldn't stop thinking about the young woman. Her face, her voice, her eyes, all of it lingered in his mind, disrupting the carefully constructed routine of his life. Without fully understanding why, he felt a pull to find her again, to offer her a way out of the life she was trapped in. And so, Alexander's search began, not just for a surrogate to carry his child but for the woman who, in a fleeting moment, had awakened something in him that he thought he had lost forever. The streets of Manhattan were bustling with life, as they always were in the late evening. Cars honked impatiently. Pedestrians hurried across crosswalks, and the neon signs of nearby stores bathed the streets in a kaleidoscope of colors. Alexander Sterling, seated in his sleek black Bentley, was eager to escape the chaos. The city he once ruled with unwavering confidence now felt like an endless cacophony, a stark contrast to the sterile silence of his penthouse. As he waited at a red light near Central Park, Alexander found himself glancing absently out of the window. His mind was preoccupied, juggling thoughts of business meetings, contracts, and the relentless loneliness that had begun to weigh heavier with each passing day. It was then that he noticed her. She stood at the corner, her frame wrapped in a thin, tattered coat that did little to shield her from the biting autumn wind. Her disheveled hair framed a pale face marked by exhaustion. Yet her eyes, an arresting shade of blue, seemed to pierce through the noise and motion of the city. She was young, perhaps no older than her late 20s. But life had clearly dealt her a cruel hand. Sophia Leclerc approached the line of cars cautiously, her movements hesitant, as if each step toward the waiting vehicles required immense effort. When she reached Alexander's car, she hesitated, her gaze meeting his through the glass. For a moment, neither moved. "Do you have anything to spare?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a mixture of dignity and desperation. Alexander, used to brushing off such encounters, instinctively reached for the button to roll up his window. But as his hand moved, he found himself pausing. There was something in her eyes, an unspoken resilience, a quiet strength, that struck a chord he hadn't felt in years. "Wait," he said, almost surprising himself. Sophia straightened slightly, her expression a mixture of wariness and curiosity. She had been turned away more times than she could count and wasn't expecting anything different from this man, whose tailored suit and luxury car screamed wealth and privilege. Alexander reached into his wallet and handed her a crisp $100 bill. "Take this," he said brusquely, his tone detached but not unkind. Sophia accepted the money with a murmured, "Thank you," her eyes briefly meeting his again. She turned to leave. But before she could take another step, Alexander found himself speaking once more. "Wait," he repeated, his voice firmer this time. Sophia turned back, her brow furrowed in confusion. Alexander hesitated for a moment, unsure of what he was about to say. The idea forming in his mind was impulsive, even reckless. But it felt right in a way he couldn't fully explain. "What if I could offer you a way out of this?" he asked, gesturing vaguely to the streets around them. Sophia blinked, her expression shifting to one of cautious skepticism. "A way out?" she echoed. "Yes," Alexander said, his tone more assured now. "A chance to change your life. I'm not talking about a handout, I'm offering you something real. A deal." Sophia crossed her arms protectively, her posture defensive. What kind of deal? Alexander took a deep breath. His gaze steady as he met hers. I want a child, he said simply. An heir. But I don't want a relationship or the complications that come with one. What I need is someone to carry my child, through artificial insemination. Of course. In return, you'll receive financial support during the pregnancy and a substantial sum afterward. Enough to start over. Enough to leave this life behind. Sophia stared at him, her mind struggling to process the audacity of his proposal. You're serious? She asked after a long pause. Her voice tinged with disbelief. Completely. Alexander replied. His tone calm and businesslike. I'm offering you a mutually beneficial arrangement. No strings attached. No expectations beyond the terms of the agreement. Sophia shook her head. A bitter laugh escaping her lips. And you thought to ask a stranger on the street? I didn't plan this. Alexander admitted, his expression softening slightly. But when I saw you, I don't know. Something told me you'd understand. That you'd see this for what it is, a chance to rebuild. Sophia's arms tightened around herself, her thoughts swirling in a storm of emotions. On one hand, the idea was outrageous, almost insulting. But on the other, she couldn't ignore the desperation of her situation. She had nothing, no home, no family, no way forward. And here was a man offering her not just survival but the possibility of a future. What makes you think I'd agree to something like this? She asked finally. Her tone sharp but not dismissive. Alexander's gaze didn't waver. Because you have nothing to lose, he said bluntly. And because you deserve a chance to have something more. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Sophia searched his face, looking for signs of cruelty or manipulation. But found none. He wasn't asking out of pity, there was a pragmatism to his offer that she couldn't deny. And what happens after? She asked quietly. After the child is born? You'll be free. Alexander said. Free to take the money and build a life for yourself. I won't stand in your way. Sophia looked down at the bill in her hand, her fingers trembling. This man, with his cold demeanor and calculating tone, had just upended everything she thought she knew about her situation. She didn't trust him, not yet, but she couldn't ignore the glimmer of hope his offer represented. I need time to think, she said at last. Her voice steadied despite the turmoil inside her. Alexander nodded. Fair enough. But don't take too long. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to her. If you're interested, call me. Sophia took the card, her eyes scanning the name and number printed in crisp black lettering. Without another word, Alexander rolled up his window and drove away, leaving her standing at the intersection, clutching the card like a lifeline. As she watched the car disappear into the distance, Sophia felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time, possibility. For better or worse. Her life had just taken a turn she could never have anticipated. And Alexander, as he navigated the crowded streets toward his penthouse, couldn't shake the feeling that this impulsive decision might be the first step toward filling the void that had haunted him for so long. Sophia Leclerc had never imagined her life would lead her to living in a grand mansion on the outskirts of Manhattan, let alone under the circumstances she now found herself in. She had agreed to Alexander Sterling's unconventional offer. A decision born not of desperation alone but also of a cautious hope that it might pave the way for a better future. Though the arrangement was transactional, Sophia knew that bringing a child into the world, no matter the terms, was an act filled with profound significance. From the moment she moved into Alexander's mansion, Sophia was struck by its cold beauty. The sprawling estate was immaculate. A symphony of marble, glass, and steel, designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. Yet, despite its grandeur, the house felt devoid of warmth, a stark reflection of its owner. Sophia was given her own wing in the mansion, complete with a spacious bedroom, a private study, and even a small art studio at Alexander's insistence. "You should have everything you need to feel comfortable," he had said, his tone as detached as ever. The early days were awkward. Alexander maintained his usual businesslike demeanor, treating Sophia as though she were just another part of a well-oiled plan. Meals were often eaten in silence, their conversations limited to logistical updates about her health and the progress of the pregnancy. But as the weeks passed, the barriers between them began to show subtle cracks. It was during one of their many shared dinners that Alexander first caught a glimpse of Sophia's inner strength. She spoke of her past, her dreams of becoming an artist, the challenges she had faced, and the sacrifices she had made to chase her ambitions. Her words were measured, yet they carried an unmistakable resilience. "You're remarkably composed for someone who's been through so much," Alexander remarked one evening, his tone uncharacteristically thoughtful. Sophia offered a faint smile. "When life throws you into chaos, you either learn to swim or you drown. I've had my moments of sinking, but I'm still here." Her honesty struck a chord in Alexander. He had spent so much of his life surrounded by people who wore masks of politeness, driven by ulterior motives. But Sophia was different. Her authenticity was both disarming and magnetic. And he found himself drawn to her in ways he hadn't anticipated. At the same time, Sophia began to see beyond Alexander's cold exterior. Despite his wealth and power, there was a fragility to him that became more apparent the longer she stayed. He worked tirelessly, often retreating to his study for hours on end. But the moments when he allowed himself to pause revealed a man burdened by his own loneliness. One evening, Sophia wandered into the library and found Alexander sitting alone by the fire, a glass of whiskey in hand. His usual composed expression had softened. And for a brief moment, he looked almost vulnerable. "You're not what I expected," she said quietly, breaking the silence. Alexander looked up, startled by her presence. "What do you mean?" "I thought you'd be colder, more detached," Sophia admitted. "But you're not." "Not really." Alexander's lips curved into a faint, self-deprecating smile. "You give me too much credit." "No," Sophia said firmly. "I think you're just afraid to let people see who you really are." Her words hung in the air, and Alexander didn't respond. Instead, he gestured for her to sit. And for the first time, they talked, not about contracts or logistics, but about their lives, their fears, and their hopes. As the months passed, the dynamic between them continued to shift. Alexander began to show more concern for Sophia's well-being, checking in on her regularly and ensuring she had everything she needed. He even accompanied her to doctor's appointments, his presence a silent reassurance that she wasn't alone. Sophia, in turn, found herself drawn to his quiet acts of care. Though he often masked his feelings behind a facade of professionalism, there were moments when his true nature shone through. She saw it in the way he lingered in the doorway of the nursery they were preparing, his gaze softening as he imagined the child they would soon welcome into the world. One afternoon, as Sophia worked in the art studio Alexander had provided, he surprised her by stepping inside. "I didn't know you painted," he said, his eyes scanning the canvas she was working on. "It's been a while," Sophia admitted, wiping her hands on a cloth. "But it feels good to create again." Alexander studied the painting, a vibrant depiction of a mother and child. Their forms intertwined in a swirl of color. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. Sophia glanced at him, surprised by the genuine warmth in his voice. "Thank you," she said softly. In that moment, something shifted between them. It was as if the walls Alexander had built around himself had been lowered. If only for a moment. Allowing Sophia to see the man he truly was. As Sophia's pregnancy progressed, moments of shared joy began to emerge. Alexander, who had once viewed the child as a mere extension of his legacy, started to see the pregnancy as something more meaningful. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Sophia felt the baby move for the first time. "Alexander," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "Come here." He hesitated, unsure of what she wanted, but eventually sat beside her. "Feel this," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her belly. Alexander's eyes widened as he felt the faint flutter of movement beneath his palm. For a man who prided himself on control, the sensation was both humbling and awe-inspiring. "It's incredible," he murmured, his voice tinged with emotion. Sophia smiled, her own heart full as she saw the unguarded expression on his face. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that their bond, however unconventional, might become something deeper. By the time Sophia entered her third trimester, the connection between her and Alexander had grown undeniable. They had become confidants, their shared experiences fostering a sense of intimacy that neither had anticipated. For Alexander, the realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. He had spent years avoiding emotional entanglements. Yet here he was, drawn to Sophia in ways that defied logic. Her strength, her compassion, and her unwavering resilience had awakened something in him that he thought he had lost forever. Sophia, too, found herself grappling with feelings she hadn't expected. Alexander, for all his flaws, had shown her kindness and support in ways she had never experienced before. Beneath his stoic exterior was a man who cared deeply, even if he struggled to show it. Though neither of them spoke of their feelings, the unspoken bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. And as the due date approached, both Alexander and Sophia began to wonder if their arrangement, born of practicality, might become the foundation of something far more profound. In the stillness of the mansion, where the echoes of their shared laughter and quiet conversations lingered, Alexander and Sophia realized they were no longer just two strangers bound by a contract. They were two souls, slowly finding solace in each other's presence, and discovering that even in the most unexpected circumstances, connection and love could begin to take root. The morning was unusually quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Sophia Leclerc sat in the passenger seat of Alexander Sterling's car, her hands resting on her swollen belly. The contractions had started hours ago, but now they were coming in quick succession, her breaths shallow and measured. Alexander sat behind the wheel, his usual calm demeanor replaced with an air of urgency. The man who commanded boardrooms with ease now gripped the steering wheel tightly, navigating the bustling streets of Manhattan with a precision born of anxiety. "We're almost there," he said, his voice steady but lined with tension. Sophia nodded, her face pale but resolute. "I'm fine," she managed, though the pain was evident in her voice. When they arrived at the hospital, the medical team was already waiting, having been alerted in advance by Alexander's assistant. Sophia was quickly taken to a private suite. The room prepared with every luxury and convenience money could buy. Despite the opulence, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation and the raw reality of childbirth. The hours that followed were a blur of effort and emotion. Sophia gripped the sides of the hospital bed, her breaths coming in labored bursts as the contractions intensified. Alexander stood by her side, his usual aloofness replaced with a quiet determination. He held her hand, an anchor amidst the storm, his gaze never wavering from hers. "You're doing amazing," he said softly, his voice a rare mix of encouragement and admiration. Sophia nodded through the pain, her focus entirely on the task ahead. The room buzzed with the controlled chaos of the medical staff, their movements precise as they guided her through the final stages of labor. And then, after what felt like an eternity, it happened. A piercing cry filled the room, the unmistakable sound of new life. "It's a girl," the doctor announced, holding up a tiny, wriggling infant. Sophia collapsed back against the bed, tears streaming down her face as she caught her first glimpse of her daughter. Alexander, who had remained stoic throughout the ordeal, felt his breath catch in his throat. He took a step closer, his eyes fixed on the baby as the nurse wrapped her in a soft blanket. "She's perfect," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. But it wasn't over yet. Moments later, another cry filled the air, followed by the doctor's voice. "And here's the second, another girl." The emotions in the room intensified as the second baby was placed beside her sister, their tiny forms almost identical. Sophia's tears flowed freely now, her heart overwhelmed with a love she hadn't anticipated. Finally, the third and final cry came, louder and more robust than the first two. "A boy," the doctor declared, lifting the newborn carefully. Alexander felt a surge of something he couldn't quite describe: joy, awe, and an unshakable sense of responsibility all at once. He watched as the nurses cleaned and swaddled his son, his gaze unwavering as they handed the infant to him. "Mr. Sterling, would you like to hold him?" Alexander hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He extended his arms, his hand surprisingly steady as he took the small, warm bundle. The weight of the child in his arms was unlike anything he had ever experienced. He stared down at the boy's tiny face, the baby's features soft and peaceful. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. For Alexander, this wasn't just the culmination of a carefully calculated plan, it was a revelation. As he looked at his son and then at the two girls lying in their bassinets, he felt a depth of emotion he hadn't known he was capable of. These weren't just heirs to his legacy, they were a part of him. A bond to the world he had spent so long trying to distance himself from. "Alexander." Sophia's voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to her, still holding the boy in his arms. Her face, though pale with exhaustion, was radiant with an inner glow. "Do you want to hold them all together?" she asked, her smile soft and inviting. He nodded, his usual composure replaced with something far more human. The nurses carefully placed the two girls in his arms. And for the first time, Alexander held all three of his children. The weight was both literal and metaphorical. He felt the enormity of the moment settle over him, a profound realization that his life, once defined by power and wealth, had been forever transformed by the presence of these three tiny beings. As Alexander sat down, cradling the triplets, Sophia watched him with a mixture of awe and affection. She had seen many sides of him over the past months, the cold businessman, the guarded loner, and, occasionally, The man who allowed his kindness to shine through. But now, as she looked at him holding their children, she saw a man stripped of all pretense. His usual armor of detachment was gone, replaced with a vulnerability that was as beautiful as it was unexpected. "You're a natural," she said softly. Her voice filled with warmth. Alexander looked up at her, his expression uncharacteristically open. "I've never felt anything like this," he admitted. "They're incredible." Sophia smiled, her own heart full as she reached out to touch one of the girl's tiny hands. "They're our miracle," she said simply. The hours that followed were filled with quiet moments of connection. The medical staff came and went, ensuring that both mother and babies were healthy and comfortable. Sophia and Alexander took turns holding the triplets, marveling at their every movement, every sound. For Alexander, each moment deepened his understanding of what it meant to be a father. He found himself wondering about their futures, imagining the people they would become and the lives they would lead. Sophia, meanwhile, was overwhelmed by the love she felt, not just for the children but for Alexander as well. She had seen a side of him that few others ever did, and it had changed the way she thought about him. As the day turned to night, the triplets were placed in a bassinet beside Sophia's bed. Alexander remained in the room, unwilling to leave even for a moment. "Thank you," he said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Sophia turned to him, surprised. "For what?" "For this," he said, gesturing to the babies. "For them. For everything." Sophia's eyes softened, and she reached out to take his hand. "We did this together, Alexander. They're a part of both of us." He nodded, his gaze lingering on her. "I never thought I could feel this way," he admitted. "But now, I can't imagine life without them. Without you." Sophia's breath caught at his words. And for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. She squeezed his hand gently, her heart full. In that quiet hospital room, surrounded by their children, Alexander and Sophia realized that their journey together was only just beginning. What had started as a contract had transformed into something far greater, a bond forged by love, trust, and the miracle of life. The nursery was quiet, save for the soft breathing of the triplets as they slept peacefully in their cribs. The golden glow of the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, bathing the room in a serene light. Sophia Leclerc stood by the window, her gaze distant as she gently rocked one of the babies. She had never imagined herself here, in this mansion, holding these beautiful children, feeling both immense joy and looming heartbreak. The contract weighed heavily on her mind. 3 months had passed since she gave birth, and the day she was meant to leave was fast approaching. The terms had been clear from the start: she would carry Alexander Sterling's child, deliver the baby, and then walk away with financial security to rebuild her life. But the reality of leaving the triplets, and Alexander, was far more painful than she had anticipated. Sophia loved the children with every fiber of her being. Over the past months, she had come to know their unique quirks, the way one of the girls scrunched her nose when she was about to cry, or how the boy always reached for her finger when she held him. They weren't just children she had carried, they were her heart. And then there was Alexander. Alexander Sterling sat in his study, staring at the crumpled piece of paper in his hand. It was the original contract he had drawn up with Sophia, outlining every detail of their arrangement. At the time, it had seemed so simple, a clean, professional transaction. But now, it felt like a noose tightening around his neck. Over the past 3 months, Alexander had watched Sophia with the children. And in doing so, He had seen a side of her that only deepened his admiration. She was patient, kind, and endlessly loving. She was everything he had never allowed himself to believe he could have in his life. But the contract loomed over them like a shadow. It demanded that Sophia leave. And Alexander, a man who prided himself on keeping his promises and upholding his agreements, didn't know how to ask her to stay. Coward, he muttered to himself, tossing the paper into the fireplace. The thought of Sophia leaving filled him with a sense of dread he couldn't ignore. He knew he had to say something. But every time he tried, the words stuck in his throat. How could he ask her to stay when their relationship had been built on such clinical terms? As Alexander wrestled with his feelings, an unexpected complication arrived in the form of Daniel Carter, one of his oldest friends. Daniel was charming, charismatic, and everything Alexander was not. He had always had a way of drawing people in. And from the moment he met Sophia, it was clear he had taken an interest in her. Daniel visited the mansion under the pretense of checking in on Alexander. But his true intentions became apparent quickly. Over the next few days, he spent more and more time with Sophia, his easy smile and quick wit lighting up the room whenever he was around. Sophia appreciated Daniel's company, he was warm and friendly. A stark contrast to Alexander's reserved demeanor. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper behind his attentions. One evening, as Alexander worked late in his study, Daniel found Sophia in the garden, sitting on a bench while the babies napped in their stroller nearby. Beautiful night, isn't it? Daniel said as he approached, his hands in his pockets. Sophia smiled politely. It is. The garden's always so peaceful at this time. Daniel sat beside her, his expression unusually serious. Sophia, can I say something without you thinking I'm overstepping? She turned to him, her brows furrowing slightly. Of course. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke. I've been watching you these past few weeks, and I can't help but admire you. The way you care for those kids. The strength you've shown despite everything, it's incredible. Sophia felt a flush of embarrassment rise to her cheeks. I'm just doing what any mother would, she said softly. But you're more than that. Daniel said, his voice filled with sincerity. You're remarkable, Sophia. And I don't think Alexander realizes just how lucky he is to have you here. The mention of Alexander made her heart ache. I'm not sure he sees me that way, she said, her tone guarded. Daniel reached for her hand, his touch gentle. Maybe he doesn't. But I do. Sophia. I know this might seem sudden, but I care about you. And if you decide to leave this place, I want you to know that you don't have to do it alone. I'd like to be there for you, for whatever comes next. Sophia stared at him, stunned. Daniel's words were genuine, and she knew he meant them. But they left her feeling more conflicted than ever. Alexander had been passing through the hall when he caught sight of Sophia and Daniel in the garden. He couldn't hear their conversation. But the sight of Daniel holding her hand sent a pang of jealousy through him that was as sharp as it was unexpected. That night, as he lay in bed, Alexander replayed the scene in his mind. He had always prided himself on his composure. But the thought of losing Sophia, to anyone, let alone his oldest friend, was unbearable. The next morning, he found Sophia in the nursery, rocking one of the girls to sleep. He stood in the doorway, his usual confidence replaced with uncertainty. Sophia, he said quietly. She looked up, her expression tired but kind. Good morning, Alexander. He stepped into the room, his hands in his pockets. "I've been meaning to talk to you," he began. His voice uncharacteristically hesitant. Sophia raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "I know the terms of the contract," he said, avoiding her gaze. "But I can't ignore the fact that I don't want you to leave." Sophia's breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. "Alexander." He held up a hand, stopping her. "Please. Let me finish. I know this started as a business arrangement. But it's become more than that. You've become more than that. To me. To the children, to this home." Sophia stared at him, her emotions swirling in a storm of hope and fear. "I don't know how to say this," Alexander admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I care about you. And not just because of the children. I care about you for who you are. For everything you've brought into my life." The room fell silent as Sophia absorbed his words. She had never seen Alexander so vulnerable, so open. "Alexander," she said softly, "I never wanted to leave. But I didn't think you wanted me to stay." He took a step closer, his gaze steady. "I want you to stay, Sophia. Not because of the contract or the children. Because I can't imagine this life, my life, without you in it." Tears filled Sophia's eyes as she reached out to take his hand. For the first time, she saw the man behind the walls he had so carefully built, a man who, like her, had been searching for connection in a world that often felt cold and unyielding. As their hands intertwined, they both knew that the contract that had once defined their relationship no longer mattered. What mattered was the bond they had formed. A bond strong enough to weather whatever challenges lay ahead. In that moment, Alexander realized he didn't need to calculate or strategize his way into a future with Sophia. He simply needed to ask her to stay, and trust that she would. The morning air was heavy with tension. A stillness that seemed to mirror the emotions swirling within Alexander Sterling. He sat in his study, staring blankly at the torn edges of the contract he had held onto for so long. Today was the day, 3 months to the day since the triplets were born. The day Sophia Leclerc was supposed to leave. Alexander had always been a man of order. Someone who thrived on structure and control. Contracts were his currency. Rules his shield against the chaos of emotions. Yet, as he thought of Sophia packing her bags in the guest wing, something inside him cracked. He couldn't let her go. In her room, Sophia folded the last of her clothes into a small suitcase. The walls that had once felt so unfamiliar now carried the weight of countless memories, nights spent rocking the triplets to sleep, quiet conversations with Alexander, and moments of laughter she hadn't expected to find in such a cold, imposing mansion. The children had become her world. Their tiny smiles and soft cries filling her heart with a love she hadn't thought possible. And then there was Alexander. Sophia paused, her hands trembling as she zipped up her suitcase. She couldn't deny the feelings she had developed for him. Feelings that had grown stronger with each passing day. But she had told herself that leaving was the right thing to do. After all, their arrangement had been clear from the start. This was a contract, not a love story. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the hallway, her suitcase trailing behind her. Alexander was waiting for her at the foot of the grand staircase. He stood tall, his hands clasped behind his back. But his expression was anything but composed. As Sophia descended, their eyes met. And for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Leaving without saying goodbye. Alexander's voice was steady. But there was an edge to it. A desperation he couldn't quite hide. Sophia stopped on the final step. her suitcase still in hand. "I didn't think you'd want a drawn-out farewell," she said softly. Her gaze dropping to the floor. He stepped closer. His movements slow and deliberate. "And you think I'd just let you walk out of here without a word?" Sophia looked up at him. Her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "It's what we agreed on. Alexander." "The contract." "The contract." Alexander interrupted. His voice sharp. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the document. Holding it up for her to see. "I'm tired of hiding behind this," he said. His tone laced with emotion. Without hesitation. He tore the paper in half. The sound of ripping parchment echoing in the silent hall. He didn't stop until the contract was reduced to shreds. The pieces falling to the marble floor like confetti. Sophia gasped. Her hand flying to her mouth. "Alexander. What are you doing?" "What I should have done a long time ago," he said. His voice breaking. "Sophia. This contract, it doesn't matter anymore. None of it does. What matters is you. What matters is us." He stepped closer. His gray eyes locking onto hers. "When I first made this arrangement, I told myself it was about control. About ensuring my legacy without the mess of emotions. But then you came into my life. Sophia. And you changed everything." Sophia's breath hitched as she listened. Her heart pounding in her chest. "You showed me what it means to care about someone." Alexander continued. "To let them in. Even when it terrifies you. Watching you with the children. Seeing the love and patience you give them, it made me realize how much I want that. Not just for them. But for myself. And not with anyone else, only with you." Tears streamed down Sophia's face as Alexander's words washed over her. She had never seen him like this, vulnerable. Raw. And unguarded. "I don't want you to stay because of the children," he said. His voice trembling. "I want you to stay because I love you. Sophia. I love you in a way I didn't think I was capable of. And if you leave, I don't know how I'll go on." For a moment, Sophia was too stunned to speak. She had dreamed of hearing those words from Alexander. But she had never believed they would come. Finally, she stepped forward. Her hand reaching for his. "Alexander," she whispered. Her voice thick with emotion. "I've been trying to convince myself that leaving was the right thing to do. That I could walk away and be fine. But the truth is, I love you too." Alexander's breath caught. His eyes widening in disbelief. "I've loved you for a long time," Sophia admitted. Her tears falling freely now. "But I was too afraid to say it. I thought you only saw me as part of the arrangement. As someone temporary. I didn't think you felt the same way." Alexander cupped her face in his hands. His touch gentle yet firm. "You're not temporary. Sophia. You never were." She leaned into his touch. Her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and joy. "I want to stay," she said softly. "Not because of the contract. Or even the children. I want to stay because I want to be with you." Alexander pulled her into an embrace. Holding her as if he would never let go. For the first time in years. He felt whole. The triplets' cries echoed faintly from the nursery. Breaking the moment with a sound that made them both smile. "Looks like our children have perfect timing," Sophia said with a laugh. Wiping her tears. Alexander chuckled. His arms still wrapped around her. "Our children," he repeated. Savoring the words. They walked to the nursery together. Hand in hand. As they entered, the sight of their 3 little ones brought a renewed sense of purpose and love. "This is our family," Alexander said, his voice full of conviction. And I'll do whatever it takes to make sure we stay together. Sophia looked up at him, her heart full. We will. Alexander. Because now, we're finally where we're meant to be. That evening, as the family sat together, the mansion no longer felt cold or empty. It was filled with the warmth of laughter, the softness of love, and the promise of a future they would build together. What had begun as a contract had transformed into something far greater, a life shared, a love realized, and a family complete. The grand Sterling mansion, once a cold and imposing fortress of solitude, was now alive with the sounds of life and laughter. The once muted halls echoed with the joyful giggles of children and the warm hum of love and family. Alexander Sterling stood on the terrace, his gaze fixed on the sprawling gardens below where Sophia and their 3 children played. A soft smile graced his face, one that came effortlessly now, in a life transformed by love. Today was their wedding day. The ceremony was a quiet and intimate affair, a reflection of the bond Alexander and Sophia had forged through trials and triumphs. The mansion's gardens had been transformed into a picturesque setting, adorned with flowers in soft hues of white and lavender. Close friends and family gathered under the shade of an ancient oak tree, its branches outstretched as if blessing the union taking place beneath. Sophia stood at the top of the garden steps, radiant in a flowing gown of ivory silk. Her blue eyes sparkled with a mix of joy and tears as she looked toward Alexander, who waited for her at the altar, holding their youngest daughter in his arms. The other 2 children sat nearby, their curious eyes wide as they watched the magical scene unfold. As Sophia walked toward him, Alexander felt his heart swell. He had always thought of himself as a man immune to sentiment. Yet here he was, utterly captivated by the woman who had changed everything. When she reached him, he handed their daughter to Sophia's maid of honor and took her hands in his. You've made me believe in things I thought were impossible, Alexander said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. You've given me a family, a home, and a reason to live beyond my work. Today, I vow to love you with everything I have, for as long as I live. The months following their wedding were a time of adjustment and growth. But above all, they were filled with joy. Alexander, who had once been consumed by his business, found himself rediscovering life through the eyes of his children. The triplets, Amelia, Elise, and Henry, were the heart of the household. Each had their own distinct personality. Amelia, the curious and fearless explorer; Elise, the gentle and empathetic observer; and Henry, the lively and mischievous charmer. Together, they brought an endless stream of surprises and challenges that Alexander and Sophia navigated together with love and patience. The mansion itself began to reflect the changes in their lives. What had once been a space dominated by cold, modern minimalism now pulsed with warmth and character. Children's drawings adorned the walls of the study where Alexander once pored over financial reports. The nursery, once carefully staged and sterile, became a chaotic but vibrant haven of toys and laughter. Even the staff, who had once treated their roles with professional detachment, became part of the family. They doted on the children, and their smiles came more easily in the lively atmosphere Sophia had brought to the home. Sophia's tears flowed freely now, her smile radiant. You saved me, Alexander. Not just from the life I was living, but from the fear that I would never be loved for who I truly am. You've shown me that even the hardest hearts can heal. And for that, I will love you endlessly. With the exchange of rings and the sealing kiss, Alexander and Sophia became husband and wife. Bound not by a contract but by the purest form of love. For Alexander, the transition from a life of calculated control to one of shared vulnerability was not without its challenges. But every time he found himself overwhelmed, Sophia was there to guide him. One evening, as the children slept and the house fell quiet, Alexander found Sophia in the art studio he had built for her. She was working on a painting, a vivid, joyful depiction of their family playing in the garden. He stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment before stepping inside. "You've captured it perfectly," he said, his voice soft. Sophia turned to him, her smile gentle. "Captured what?" "How you've changed this house. This family. Me." Sophia set down her brush and walked over to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "You've changed too, Alexander. You let us in. That's the greatest gift you could have given." He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I didn't know what I was missing until I met you. Thank you for not giving up on me." The triplets were growing quickly, each milestone bringing new excitement to their lives. Amelia's first steps had sent Alexander running through the garden, ready to catch her if she fell. Elisa's first words, "Mama" and "Dada," brought tears to Sophia's eyes. And Henry's unrelenting curiosity kept everyone on their toes as he explored every corner of the mansion. Sophia often marveled at how natural Alexander had become as a father. Where once he had been distant and reserved, he was now hands-on and present. He would spend hours reading to the children, teaching them to build block towers, or simply holding them as they drifted to sleep. One day, as the family sat together in the garden, Sophia watched as Alexander helped Henry build a miniature fort out of sticks and leaves. Elise sat in her lap, babbling happily, while Amelia toddled over to show her a flower she had picked. "This," Sophia thought, her heart full, "is what love looks like." As the years passed, the Sterling family continued to grow, not in size, but in strength and unity. Alexander and Sophia's love deepened with each challenge they faced together, their bond unshaken by the trials of parenthood and the demands of life. The mansion, once a symbol of Alexander's solitary ambition, had become a home filled with memories and love. It was a place where laughter echoed through the halls, where walls once meant to separate now embraced a family that had found each other against all odds. On their 5th wedding anniversary, as the family gathered around the dining table for a quiet celebration, Alexander looked at Sophia and their children with a profound sense of gratitude. "I spent so much of my life chasing things that didn't matter," he said, raising his glass. "But now, I know what's truly important. It's all of you. Thank you for giving me a reason to be more than I ever thought I could be." Sophia smiled, her hand resting on his. "And thank you, Alexander, for letting love in." The Sterling family's story was one of transformation, not just of a house or a man, but of the power of love to break down barriers and rebuild lives. Alexander and Sophia had turned an arrangement into a partnership, a contract into a family, and a mansion into a home. Their children grew up surrounded by love and laughter, carrying with them the lessons their parents had learned the hard way, that true wealth lies not in what you have, but in the people you share your life with. And as the years turned into decades, the Sterling mansion stood as a testament to their journey, a place where love had triumphed over loneliness, and where a family had found its forever home.